Grace Monroe stepped onto the flight with an air of quiet determination that belied the storm brewing within her. Dressed in a neat navy blazer over a white blouse, she carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who had battled more than her fair share of injustice. Her slim leather briefcase swung gently at her side as she made her way to her assigned seat in first class, seat 3A. To onlookers, she appeared simply as a diligent lawyer on a routine trip for a corporate acquisition, but those familiar with her background knew there was far more to her story than business reports and legal briefs. Grace was a fighter, a trailblazer in a world that often underestimated her because of the color of her skin, and she was about to prove that underestimating her came at a dear price. The early morning buzz of the airport was a distant murmur compared to the charged silence inside the cabin. As Grace carefully settled into her seat, reviewing legal documents on her tablet, she sensed an unsettling scrutiny from across the aisle. Diana Briggs, a senior flight attendant known for her icy demeanor and flawless uniform, fixed her icy blue eyes on Grace as she moved with a deliberately measured gait. Diana's expression was unreadable as she approached Grace, her steps echoing with an authority that brooked no defiance. "Excuse me, ma'am," Diana said, her tone as cool and sharp as a knife's edge. Grace's response was polite yet unwavering as she confirmed her seat assignment, handing over her boarding pass without hesitation, even as Diana's frown deepened in a manner that hinted at something far more sinister than mere protocol. Almost immediately, the atmosphere shifted. Diana demanded to inspect Grace's identification, a request that felt pointedly selective when no one else had been subjected to such treatment. Grace, ever composed, produced her driver's license and allowed Diana to scrutinize it, her inner heart pounding with a mixture of indignation and sorrow. The silence that followed was more oppressive than any outburst could be, as passengers exchanged uneasy glances and whispered among themselves. Grace's calm exterior belied the mounting sense of injustice, the weight of centuries of discrimination that she carried silently with every measured breath. Then, without any forewarning, Diana's hand lashed out. In one swift, ruthless motion, she slapped Grace across the cheek. The sound of that slap cut through the cabin like a bolt of lightning, drawing gasps and shocked stares from every seat in first class. The rouge print on Grace's cheek was not merely a mark of physical pain. It was a symbol of a centuries-old cruelty that had no place in a modern era. For a full minute, Grace sat frozen, the reality of the assault anchoring her to her seat while the room turned into a theater of silent horror. Meanwhile, behind her, a man known only as Elliot Grant, an influential private investor with a reputation for shrewd business acumen, watched with eyes that blazed with barely contained fury. He was not merely an observer. He was Grace's client, and a man who understood that this act of blatant, senseless aggression could no longer be tolerated. The cabin's air grew even heavier as Elliot leaned forward, his voice a soft but lethal murmur. "Are you all right?" Grace managed a small nod while her inner resolve solidified. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them, a promise of retribution that would shake the very foundations of the small world on board that flight. And as Elliot swiftly typed on his phone, sending out cryptic instructions to his legal team, Grace's fingers trembled, not from pain alone, but from the raw intensity of her resolve. This was not going to be a mere incident to be filed away. This was an affront that demanded justice and an explosive reckoning. What came next was a chain reaction that no one in the cabin could have foreseen. As Diana briskly made her way back toward the galley, her steps growing increasingly erratic, she appeared to be trying desperately to maintain control. But the more she tried to cloak her cruelty, the more evident it became to everyone that this was no isolated incident. The overt racism, the calculated selection of Grace as a target because of who she was, reeked of an old poisonous prejudice that had no place in a modern flight. Passengers who had once been content to linger in the background now cast furtive, condemning glances toward Diana. In hushed tones, they began to question the values that allowed such discrimination and blatant abuse to go unchecked. Back in her seat, Grace fought valiantly to keep her composure, though her heart pounded with a mix of shame, anger, and deep sorrow. She knew that Diana's actions were not merely personal misbehavior. They were a reflection of a systemic injustice that had haunted her community for generations. Each cold stare, each whispered word from nearby passengers only intensified her determination to see that Diana's cruelty did not go unpunished. As the flight continued, subtle signs of unrest began to ripple through the cabin. The once hush of first class gradually transformed into an atmosphere thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed that a storm was coming. Elliot's phone call to his private airline attorney was a silent declaration of war. In a matter of minutes, orders were dispatched that would not only bring the matter to the attention of the highest echelons of corporate power, but would also ensure that Diana was held accountable in a manner that would leave no doubt about the consequences of her actions. The cabin, once a symbol of exclusivity and refined elegance, was rapidly turning into a battleground where the clash between old prejudices and new justice was about to come to a head. Grace's phone buzzed, and as she read Elliot's curt message, "Say nothing more, I'm handling it now," a surge of vindictive hope coursed through her veins. The message confirmed what she already knew deep down, that the scales of justice were about to be dramatically rebalanced in her favor. Word of the incident soon spread far beyond that single flight, igniting a firestorm of public outcry that left many, especially those who had long felt the sting of racial injustice, feeling a long overdue vindication. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting the stark contrast between the serene facade of first class and the explosive reality of a prejudiced system struggling to hold on to outdated power dynamics. Women across the nation, particularly those in their golden years, who had witnessed decades of change and were no strangers to injustice, rallied behind Grace, their voices imbued with both nostalgia for a fairer past and hope for a future where such cruelty could no longer flourish. In the ensuing legal battles, Grace not only sought compensation for her personal suffering, but also aimed to set a powerful precedent, a clarion call that no one, regardless of their status or station, would ever be allowed to trample on the dignity of another. Her case became a beacon for change, a stirring reminder that the fight for justice was not merely a private endeavor, but a collective mission to cleanse the lingering stains of discrimination. And as every new piece of evidence was unveiled, every testimony corroborated, the once silent flight became a powerful stage for a grand retribution, a retribution that promised to be as sweeping as it was historic. In that reckoning, the cruelty of Diana Briggs would be laid bare for all to see, and the delicate scales of justice would finally tip in favor of those who had suffered in silence for far too long. Grace Monroe's journey from that painful moment aboard the aircraft to her eventual triumphant stand in the courtroom was not just a personal victory. It was a resounding statement to a society in desperate need of change. With unwavering courage, she turned humiliation into a battle cry, transforming her pain into a force powerful enough to shake the very pillars of corporate might and antiquated prejudice. Her story, recounted over many years, would serve as a lesson not only to those who doubted her resolve, but to every individual who had ever been diminished by discrimination. A living testament that even in the darkest moments, the promise of justice can ignite a revolution of hope, compassion, and ultimately, triumphant revenge. Grace Monroe sat resolutely in her first-class seat as the events on board unfolded with a tension that cut deeper than any turbulence the flight might encounter. The recent apology from Diana Briggs had done little to soothe the ache of indignity that still pulsed like an unwanted reminder on her cheek. As the aircraft cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the aftermath of the incident lingered like a stubborn stain on an otherwise pristine white blouse. Grace's gaze, steady and calculating, swept across the cabin, absorbing every detail. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, charged with an unspoken agreement that what had transpired would have lasting consequences. A warning sign that the authority, once taken for granted, was crumbling. beneath a wave of accountability. In the midst of it all, Diana Briggs, her uniform now rumpled and her once commanding expression fraught with uncertainty, crouched down near row 3 in a desperate bid to salvage what little dignity she had left. Her voice, which mere minutes before had boomed with imperious authority, was now reduced to a shaky murmur. "Miss Clark, I want to apologize for what happened earlier," she said, forcing a smile that immediately betrayed her inner turmoil. Gay's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and with a calm tone that belied the storm inside her, she replied, "No, Deanna, don't try to reframe it. You hit me, and you did it in full view of every single person in this cabin." The words fell heavy in the air, stirring discomfort among passengers and sending a clear message that the gesture was not to be glossed over. A few passengers who had been pretending to immerse themselves in their magazines or devices began to shift in their seats. Their eyes darted around, betraying a mixture of disbelief and empathy as they absorbed every word. Some whispered to neighbors while others stared in silent condemnation. Across the aisle, Elliot Grant, who had maintained an intimidating calm throughout the ordeal, leaned forward ever so slightly. His eyes, as sharp as the precision of his tailored charcoal suit, reflected both approval and steely resolve. In that moment, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from one of passive observation to active anticipation of what was to come. Diana's apology, intended to quench the flames of the immediate conflict, only deepened the divide between her and Grace. Grace's measured tone left little room for reconciliation. "I had a valid ticket. I showed my ID and I answered every question you asked. Then you, without warning, slapped me right in front of everyone," she stated, her voice both soft and unyielding. The echoes of her calm accusation resonated in the silent cabin, making it clear that this was not a mere lapse of judgment. It was an act steeped in an unspoken prejudice that had chosen her as its victim. At that moment, Diana's face reddened, not merely from the physical effort of her own apology, but also from the crushing weight of her own guilt. She mumbled something about overreacting, but Grace's reply was firm and unforgiving. "Overreacting is not a mistake. It was a decision that stemmed from your own biases and assumptions about who I am," Grace continued, her eyes glinting with the promise of retribution. It was as if every word amplified the inherent tension between the power that Grace represented and the crumbling facade of control that Diana had long depended upon. As the conversation lingered, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the cabin. Passengers, who had earlier been content with mere observation, began to feel as if they too bore some responsibility for what had occurred. Their collective silence was not one of agreement, but rather an admission of complicity in the pervasive culture of inaction. Elliot, ever the strategist, maintained a watchful silence. His phone buzzed softly, delivering updates from his legal team, a confirmation that every detail of the incident was being meticulously documented. Messages flashed across the screen like coded instructions. The incident was confirmed, a statement was being drafted, full passenger reports were being collected, and most damning of all, the airline's CEO had been notified to launch an internal inquiry immediately. These developments were not lost on Grace. She knew the rules of engagement on a corporate battlefield, and tonight the cabin of that aircraft had transformed into a microcosm of a much larger struggle. A struggle against complacency, against systemic racism, and against the arrogance of those who had long taken their power for granted. The entire sequence of events was etched into her mind with clinical precision. Every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance, and every nervous tap on a smartphone was a piece of evidence in a case that would soon rock the foundations of the airline industry. Aboard the same flight, Diana now retreated into the relative solitude of the galley. There, leaning against the counter with trembling hands, she tried to compose herself. Her career, which had spanned over 13 years and had been built on the rigid standards of discipline and order, lay in tatters. The institution that had once sheltered her confidence, was now exposing her vulnerability in full light. Jessica Mills, a younger flight attendant who had watched the unfolding drama with both sympathy and a measured degree of professional detachment, approached her cautiously. "You did raise your voice, Diana," Jessica observed quietly, unable to mask her disappointment. Diana's response was a blend of defensiveness and resignation. "I did because there was nothing left to say." However, deep within Diana's troubled eyes flickered the realization that she had underestimated Grace Monroe. This was not just an isolated outburst or a spontaneous lapse in protocol. It was a deliberate act, a manifestation of the entrenched racism and authoritarian arrogance that Grace had experienced time and time again. The realization struck Diana with cruel clarity. She had chosen the wrong person to target. Meanwhile, Grace, still sitting in row 3, continued to unlock her phone and monitor every update, her mind racing as she pieced together the unfolding narrative. A message from her firm's partner confirmed that the airline's CEO had called Elliot directly and that the ensuing investigation was far from over. "You are not getting off this flight the way you came on," the message read, its tone as icy as the altitude outside the window. Elliot's calm appraisal of the situation, his voice barely above a whisper yet imbued with unyielding determination, reassured Grace that the battle was only beginning. "You handled that well," he said, though the hint of irony was unmistakable. Grace's retort was measured. "You could feel it the moment she looked at me like I didn't belong." Elliot's acknowledgement of that exclusion was both a personal reminder and a strategic observation. He confirmed that the oversight was not merely a personal affront, but a systemic injustice that extended far beyond the cramped space of first class. As the aircraft continued its journey across the clear blue sky, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some attempted to divert their attention to their devices, while others exchanged furtive glances that carried the weight of silent apologies, a recognition that in that moment of crisis, no one was truly innocent. Even the man in a blazer who had earlier remained an indifferent bystander now leaned forward and stammered, "I saw what happened earlier," in a feeble attempt to bridge the chasm of indifference. Grace's gaze slowly turned toward him, her expression revealing the disappointment of yet another witness complicit in silence. "Then perhaps you should not be the one explaining what happened," she replied evenly, her calm intensity underscoring that words alone would not suffice to mend the rift wrought by blatant abuse and discrimination. Within the galley, Diana's internal struggle became palpable. She sank down onto a small crew bench, her face buried in her hands as the enormity of her actions washed over her. The realization that she had chosen an easy target, a woman who was not only resilient, but who also represented the broader fight for racial equality, was a bitter pill to swallow. Her trembling fingers betrayed the fear and uncertainty that now defined her future in the skies. Jessica's soft voice broke the silence. "You picked the wrong one today." The words, delivered without malice but with a clear undercurrent of judgment, reverberated in Diana's mind like a relentless echo. "What is that supposed to mean?" she managed to ask, though her voice was tinged with both indignation and sorrow. Jessica's reply was unambiguous. "You are not going to cry in the laboratory or post a video for sympathy. You are going to change the story." Those words, meant to unmask the hypocrisy behind Diana's carefully constructed persona, struck her with the force of cold reality. For the first time in her long career, Diana felt the weight of every discriminatory assumption and every careless decision that had ever shaped her behavior. Back in row 3, Grace checked her phone as another message arrived from her legal team. The update was terse yet loaded with consequence. The full passenger manifest had been secured, multiple eyewitnesses had confirmed every detail, and a passenger in row 5 had begun recording a detailed statement. Elliot's next message, firm and uncompromising, instructed the compilation of every detail, including the timeline, to be presented to the airline board within 6 hours of landing. Each new piece of evidence was another brick in the meticulously built case against the airline's tolerance of unchecked abuse. In that moment, as Grace showed the screen to Elliot, he nodded once, a silent affirmation that spoke volumes. "Good," he said quietly, his tone indicating that the mission had just escalated from simple retribution to a battle for systemic change. Gradually, as the final hours of the flight approached, the seatbelt sign chimed its gentle reminder of safety, yet the heavy atmosphere in the cabin could not be alleviated by such mundane signals. Passengers continued to maintain a guarded silence, fully aware that the events of that flight had far-reaching implications. The gentle clink of tray tables closing, the rustle of folded blankets, and the methodical clearing of drinks were mere background noise to the silent storm of responsibility unfolding. Grace remained composed, her eyes fixed on the vast expanse of clouds outside the window, a stark contrast to the heavy, oppressive reality within the cabin. Beneath her calm exterior, however, her mind was a whirlwind of strategic planning. She was not simply a lawyer. She was a visionary strategist who had transformed personal pain into the groundwork for far-reaching accountability. Each moment, every detail, from the tone in Diana's voice to the furtive glances of fellow passengers, was being cataloged as part of a case that would bring even the highest echelons of corporate power to their knees. Elliot, ever vigilant, leaned slightly toward Grace as he once again confirmed the updates on his phone. "They are planning damage control. The call from the CEO is not simply an apology, it is a containment move," he remarked, his voice low and measured. Grace's eyes narrowed with resolve. "Then, maybe we don't give them time to scramble," she responded, the finality in her tone underscoring an unyielding promise of justice. Every detail that had unfolded, from the initial demeaning slap to the whispered admissions and the calculated maneuvers of corporate power, was converging toward a moment of reckoning that would shatter the veneer of perfection carefully maintained by the airline industry. The gravity of the situation was felt not only in the documents being drafted or the phone calls being made, but also in the silent, shared understanding among the passengers. The collective experience of witnessing such blatant discrimination, when paired with the mounting evidence of complicity from those around her, fueled Grace's determination. She recalled every moment from the very first interaction, the steely glances, the dismissive gestures, and most poignantly, the resounding impact of that singular moment of violence. In her mind, she was not only fighting for herself, but for every person who had ever suffered at the hands of injustice. As the aircraft began its descent toward its destination, the tension remained thick, almost tangible. Diana, now largely a shadow of her former authoritative self, lingered near the galley as if waiting for the inevitable judgment that would come once the plane touched down. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions, regret, fear, and a deep-seated awareness that her actions had ignited a blaze she could no longer control. Jessica's earlier words echoed in her mind, a stark reminder that the system she had once commanded now turned its back on her. With trembling hands, Diana tried to smooth out the creases in her uniform, knowing that every move, every gesture was being scrutinized not just by her fellow crew members, but by a larger corporate machine determined to root out the seeds of discrimination. Grace, meanwhile, sat immobile in row 3, every nerve in her body attuned to the soft hum of the plane and the subtle disturbances among the passengers. The silent recording of events, combined with the unyielding support from powerful allies like Elliot, had shifted the balance of power. She was now a beacon for change, a living testament to the fact that even in an environment teeming with unspoken complicity, one individual's resolve could set in motion a reckoning that would echo far beyond the confines of a single flight. Her eyes reflected not only the beauty of the passing clouds, but also the determination and resolve that came from years of battling bias and injustice. She had witnessed the dismissal of her rights, the casual display of racial prejudice, and now she was poised to transform those painful moments into a legacy of accountability. In that decisive hour before landing, as the cabin lights dimmed and the aircraft's altitude decreased steadily, the overarching narrative of retribution was set into motion. Grace Monroe was ready to confront the airline executives and push for a thorough inquiry into the appalling incident, a move that would not only restore her dignity, but also serve as a powerful indictment against a system that had long perpetuated inequality. Elliot's quiet assurances and the steady stream of evidence gave her the courage to articulate not just her personal story, but the story of every victim of discrimination who had ever been made to feel small in the eyes of authority. The final minutes before landing were punctuated by formal announcements and the routine bustle of cabin crew preparing for disembarkation. But beneath that veneer of normalcy lay the seeds of revolution. Grace's mind was already racing with plans for the legal proceedings that would follow. Every detail was being recalled. The unwarranted questioning of her ticket and identity, the humiliating slap inflicted before a room of silent witnesses, and the shattering implications of an apology that was too little, too late. This was her moment to reclaim not only her personal honor, but to also dismantle the toxic structures that had allowed such cruelty to thrive. When the plane finally touched down on a sunlit runway, measured in miles rather than kilometers, the air outside was crisp with the promise of change. The aircraft, once a symbol of exclusivity and privilege, had transformed into a battleground of justice and retribution. As passengers disembarked, their expressions were a mixture of relief and lingering sadness, each carrying their own silent stories of witnessing an injustice that had been allowed to unfold in plain sight. For Grace Monroe, the journey was far from over. Her phone buzzed again, a final message from Elliot confirming that the CEO himself had summoned her for a private call once on solid ground. A call that would mark the beginning of a public reckoning and the unfolding of a legal drama that promised to shake the airline industry to its core. In that moment, as she gathered her belongings and prepared to step off the aircraft, Grace felt an empowering surge of purpose. This incident, which had once threatened to strip her of her dignity, had instead ignited a fire within her, one that burned with the promise of justice, accountability, and a resounding message to all who sought to oppress the marginalized. The passengers, whose silence had been a painful reminder of complicity, now bore witness to her determination. With every step toward the terminal, Grace Monroe knew that her legacy would be defined not by the insult she had suffered, but by the monumental victory of turning that very insult into a catalyst for sweeping change. As the sun rose over the tarmac, bathing the scene in a soft golden hue, Grace took a deep breath and smiled ever so slightly. The injustices of the past would no longer hold sway over her future. Instead, she was prepared to write a new chapter, a chapter where the scales of justice were finally balanced in favor of those who had long been denied their rightful dignity. The promise of accountability and retribution resonated in her every thought, a promise that the cruelty enacted in that first-class cabin would be met with a response so grand and uncompromising that it would leave onlookers both shocked and inspired. In the days and weeks that followed, Grace prepared to take on not just her personal adversary, but an entire system that had allowed such prejudice to fester unchecked. In boardrooms and courtrooms across the nation, her case would serve as a rallying cry for change, a reminder that the fight against discrimination was not just a battle for individual rights, but a battle for the soul of an entire industry. The powerful allies she had gathered, including Elliot and a dedicated legal team, were ready to dismantle the old guard with surgical precision. Their efforts would culminate in a dramatic confrontation that would see the airline's legacy of indifference shattered in a wave of uncompromising retribution. For Grace Monroe, the flight had become more than a journey from one destination to another. It had become the stage for a transformative saga that would echo through the halls of corporate power. The events on board that fateful flight would soon make headlines across the country, sparking conversations about accountability, racial discrimination, and the urgent need for systemic reform. As the legal proceedings unfolded and the details of the assault were laid bare before an increasingly outraged public, Grace's unwavering stance would come to symbolize a broader fight for justice and dignity in a world that too often turned a blind eye to the plight of the vulnerable. In her final private moments on the airplane, while the chatter of arriving passengers faded into the background, Grace stood by a window looking out over the sprawling airport. With the reflection of a determined woman staring back at her, she silently vowed that the injustice she had suffered would pave the way for a legacy of change. The silence that had once been filled with passive complicity was now charged with the roar of anticipation, a roar that promised that every wrong would eventually be righted. And so, as she stepped off the plane and into the crisp American morning, Grace Monroe carried with her not just the scars of a humiliating attack, but the fierce determination to transform those scars into symbols of a revolution that would leave everyone, regardless of age, truly saying, in a tone of both admiration and awe, that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Grace Monroe felt the weight of every judging stare and every hushed whisper as the flight neared its end. Her heart still pounded from the earlier humiliation, but now there was something different in the air, a brewing storm of consequences that promised to upend the old order. The memory of the chilling moment when Diana Briggs, once so confident and authoritative, had struck her in public was never far from her mind. Now, as the plane taxied closer to the runway, the silence in the cabin was loaded with questions. Everyone was looking at her, silently wondering what she would do next, wondering if she even realized the magnitude of what had been done. In the wake of that fateful slap, Diana had tried to muster an apology. She had approached Grace, once known by her given name Vanessa, now forever etched in everyone's memory as a symbol of enduring dignity under fire. But Grace had been unsympathetic and unwavering when she said, in no uncertain terms, that the mistake was not just a misstep, it was a deliberate act rooted in prejudice. Diana's apology, halting and unconvincing, had only deepened the rift between them. As Diana struggled to find words, her mind reeling from the self-realization of the deep-seated bias that had led her to that moment, she stood frozen in a corner of the cabin, her mouth open yet no sound emerging. For the first time in her long career, she was faced not with the backing of a uniform or an unquestioning system, but with the undeniable truth of her own cruelty. Meanwhile, in row 3, Grace Monroe's phone vibrated again. With steady hands and an unshakable gaze, she opened a message from her firm's senior partner. The message was succinct yet foreboding. The media team was in place, plans were set to delay any public release by 1 hour post-landing, and security protocols had already been activated at the gate. Grace showed this message to Elliot Grant, her steadfast ally who, dressed immaculately in a tailored suit, had become her silent partner in this fight for justice. Elliot's quiet nod and his softly spoken directive, "When we land, you speak first," reinforced that Grace was the one who had been underestimated, not only by a biased flight attendant, but by an entire culture that had long believed silence was its safest ally. As a woman who had faced discrimination all her life, Grace knew that her calm demeanor and measured words were her greatest weapons. She had endured enough to understand that when she spoke, every word carried the weight of years of struggle and resilience. So when a businesswoman sitting several rows ahead timidly apologized for not stepping forward during the earlier incident, her voice wavering with remorse, Grace's response was clear and unyielding. That is exactly the problem. There was no space in her heart for hollow apologies. Actions had consequences, and by letting this injustice slide, the culture of complacency would only be further entrenched. In the cabin, the tension was almost tangible. The captain's measured voice crackled through the intercom, reminding the passengers that they would soon begin their descent. Yet, no matter how smoothly the aircraft glided through the skies at 35,000 feet, the undercurrent of turmoil persisted. Every crew member, from the ones still lingering near the galley to the flight attendants meticulously rechecking their service routines, was enveloped in an atmosphere of foreboding responsibility. Even the passengers, so used to the distractingly superficial chatter of in-flight magazines, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that something monumental had occurred. Back in row 3, Grace remained calm but alert, her eyes scanning the cabin with unwavering focus. She knew that every whispered remark and every downcast gaze from fellow passengers was a testament to the unspoken acknowledgement of what had occurred. Her phone buzzed once again, this time with a message from her firm's media advisor. The situation was trending internally, with holding statements ready to be released at the right moment, and the crisis management team on standby. Grace placed her phone down on her tray table with deliberate calm, her mind already orchestrating a response that would ensure the truth was acknowledged and that accountability would be met head-on. Elliot's reassuring words, uttered in a low, steady tone, reminded her that there was no need to prove her worth now. Her actions and her resilience had already done that. "You already did," he said softly, echoing the confidence that resonated in her every movement. Yet Grace's reply was as firm as it was resolute. "I am not finished yet." Her voice carried not anger or bitterness, but the quiet determination of someone who had been pushed too far and was now ready to reclaim her dignity publicly. As the final minutes of the flight ticked away, a palpable shift spread through the aircraft. Passengers no longer exchanged polite smiles or idle conversation about connecting flights and vacation plans. Instead, there was a slow, almost deliberate awareness that they had all witnessed something irreversible. In a hushed conversation a few rows back, a middle-aged man spoke in a conspiratorial tone to his neighbor, asking if Grace would lose her job over the incident, to which she could only indirectly respond with a look that said everything. She had already won the moral high ground. Near the front of the plane, Diana Briggs, consumed by regret and internal chaos, had taken to the galley. There, her hands trembled as she gripped the cold metal of the counter. Each passing second was an eternity in which she reevaluated her every decision. For years she had prided herself on her instincts and her ability to read people, but now, with her very identity as a flight attendant tarnished by her baseless act of aggression, she realized she had betrayed not only her professional pride but her own humanity. The realization was as brutal as it was inescapable. Her every action had been driven by a bias so deep she could no longer deny that her uniform had become a shield for her cruelty rather than a symbol of service and respect. At that moment, Jessica Mills, the kind-eyed and soft-spoken crew member who had silently witnessed the drama unfold, entered the galley and offered Diana a small glass of water. "Drink," Jessica said gently, as if aware that this simple act of compassion was the only small solace in a tide of regret. But even as Diana accepted the water, her mind churned with thoughts of how her actions would be forever remembered, a blot on her record that would follow her long after this flight landed. Jessica's words, spoken with quiet conviction, cut even deeper. "They are not going to forget what happened just because we land. Your name is going to be known far beyond this aircraft." Diana's eyes lowered, knowing that there was no escaping the truth of what she had done. Back in row 3, Grace checked her phone yet again, absorbing another update from her firm. The message was chilling in its simplicity. The media was on standby, and the security team was mobilized for when they deplaned. The intricate dance of corporate crisis management was now in motion, a tactic that could try to bury the scandal under layers of legal jargon and internal memos. But Grace was determined to let the truth cut through the veneer. "No matter if the world knew immediately or 10 minutes later," she murmured to herself, "the damage is done." The revelation that not only her personal dignity, but the very reputation of a company long steeped in ritualized discrimination was at stake filled the air with a tangible intensity. Elliot checked his watch and then leaned forward, asking, 10 minutes, you ready?" Grace took a deep breath, the cool sip of resolve mingling with the nerves of anticipation. "I'm more than ready," she replied, her voice as steadfast as the flight that was about to conclude. Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned one last time to announce that the cabin crew should return to their seats for landing. The hum of the engines lowered, and the plane began its final descent, the view outside the window transitioning from billowy white clouds to the glittering city lights beyond. A stunning reminder that even the most turbulent journeys eventually find their landing. Inside the cabin, a palpable blend of resignation and anticipation hung in the air. Diana, still a shadow of the authoritative figure she once was, reluctantly made her way back to her jump seat near the front. Her hands, still trembling from the magnitude of her actions, gripped the straps with white-knuckled intensity. Jessica sat nearby, eyes filled with a mixture of pity and cautious expectation, silently urging Diana to face the music. Grace, in stark contrast, remained composed in row 3, her posture impeccable and her expression a portrait of dignified resolve. Her eyes were not directed at the passing scenery but fixed on the front of the plane, where the next chapter of this saga would begin with undeniable force. As the landing gear extended and the aircraft prepared to glide onto the runway, a sudden series of deliberate footsteps echoed through the cabin. Heads turned as a man in a crisp Navy uniform appeared at the front. His presence was imposing and unyielding, and he moved with the measured purpose of someone who meant business. Following him was another man, dressed in a sharp black suit bearing the airline's corporate emblem, his expression severe and his eyes scanning the cabin as if searching for the embodiment of the wrongdoing. With a cold efficiency that seemed to steal the last vestiges of warmth from the atmosphere, the man in uniform calmly announced, "Is Ms. Diana Briggs present?" His voice, firm and unrelenting, cut through the murmurs and silences like a scalpel. Diana's heart sank as she realized that her actions had now escalated to a level where there was no turning back. Her face grew pale, and she slowly stood from her jump seat, every movement exuding a mixture of resignation and fear. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible even to herself. The security officer's nod was the final confirmation of the consequences that would now unfold, as he informed her that she was to be formally escorted for questioning by the airline's legal counsel and executive oversight. The news rippled through the cabin, causing a collective intake of breath. Passengers now fully aware that this incident had shattered any remaining illusions of order or protection. Jessica rose from her seat nearby, her eyes wide and unblinking as she witnessed the final act of Diana's undoing. Grace observed the entire exchange with a cool detachment that only further cemented her inner strength. When Diana, in a fleeting moment before being led away, turned her head and met Grace's gaze, it was not with defiance or remorse, but with a final acknowledgement of defeat. Grace's eyes, steady and commanding, held a silent promise that this would not be the last anyone would hear of the injustice inflicted upon her. With that, Diana was gone, escorted swiftly through the front exit by security officers whose efficiency left no trace of the authority she once wielded. The cabin slowly began to stir as passengers tentatively resumed movement. Bags were gathered, and whispered conversations grew louder, all underscored by the overwhelming realization that what had transpired in that first-class cabin was more than just an isolated incident. It was the spark of a revolution against deep-seated discrimination and unchecked abuse of power. Grace remained seated in row 3, her bag neatly tucked under her seat, her eyes unwavering as she surveyed the transformed atmosphere around her. Elliot retrieved her bag with a gentle gesture, placing it before her as if to offer both support and solidarity. "Ready?" he asked softly. Grace looked down at the bag, then up at the entrance of the plane, where the true test of her dignity awaited. "Yes," she replied in a tone that was calm and resolute, "but let's not leave through the front." Elliot raised an eyebrow, surprised by her unwavering poise. "We leave with the rest of them," she said. "Let them see what it means to walk off with dignity." Together, Grace and Elliot moved slowly down the narrow aisle, shoulders set and pace measured. Every step they took was deliberate, each footfall resonating like a beat in a larger drum of justice. The eyes of the passengers, which had once been full of judgment, now shone with a mixture of realization and overdue respect. An acknowledgement of the truth that could no longer be denied. The oppressive silence that had dominated the flight was now punctuated by subtle shifts of posture and lingering glances that spoke volumes about the cost of complacency. It was clear to everyone that the journey they were on was far from over. As the aircraft door opened with a resonant mechanical click, the final chapter of this mid-air drama was poised to begin. The security detail's presence was now unmistakable, and the atmosphere was charged with the promise of accountability. Grace, sitting firmly in her designated row, maintained her composure as she prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation with the corporate machine that had long protected those who abused their authority. She was not simply a lawyer or a victim. She was a symbol of resistance, a beacon for every person who had ever been marginalized or silenced by systemic prejudice. While some passengers began to gather their belongings and others whispered in quiet clusters about the unfolding spectacle, Elliot leaned closer to Grace. "I want to meet you and Mr. Grant in the executive lounge immediately," he said quietly, referencing the final message that had arrived from their firm's crisis management team. Grace nodded, a smile playing on her lips, a smile that spoke of a fierce inner determination born of years of standing against injustice. "Let them wait," she murmured, her voice firm yet measured. "When we step off that plane, I'm going to speak, and they are going to listen." The final moments inside the aircraft were spent in a heavy, expectant quiet. Every passenger, every crew member seemed to understand that this was more than the end of a turbulent flight. It was a turning point, a moment when a system built on indifference and biased power was about to be held accountable. As the cabin lights brightened and the seatbelt sign finally extinguished, there was a collective pause. Grace remained seated, her gaze unwavering as she mentally prepared for what lay ahead. Whether it be a courtroom battle or a corporate reckoning, the fight for dignity was just beginning. As the exit doors opened and the cool American air embraced them, Grace Monroe stepped off the plane with a quiet confidence that radiated strength and resilience. Every eye in the terminal was fixed on her, not with pity, but with a deep, abiding respect for the way she had transformed humiliation into a clarion call for justice. Elliot's steady presence at her side was a reminder that she was not alone in this battle, that together they would confront the powerful forces that thrived on discrimination and unchecked authority. For Grace, the landing was not an end, but the beginning of a long-awaited reckoning. In the coming hours and days, her case would shatter the complacency of boardrooms and expose the dark underbelly of a system that had allowed such cruelty to flourish. Her voice, when it finally rang out in the executive lounge and beyond, would be a rallying cry for every woman, every person who had ever been trampled by prejudice. It would be the voice of dignity reclaimed and the promise of a future where accountability was not optional but mandatory. In that moment, as she walked through the terminal with Elliot and a cadre of determined legal experts waiting for her, Grace Monroe carried with her the scars of that flight, but also the indomitable spirit of resistance. No longer would the sounds of indifference and silence go unchallenged. The painful incident that had unfolded at 35,000 feet was now a symbol of systemic injustice, and Grace had turned that pain into a weapon. Her case would soon be dissected in the media, discussed in boardrooms, and ultimately serve as a catalyst for sweeping reforms within the airline industry and beyond. The journey ahead was fraught with challenges, but Grace knew that the battle for true equality was worth every hardship. With every step she took in that bustling terminal, she carried the hopes of countless others who had suffered in silence, and her unwavering resolve promised that their voices would finally be heard. And so, as the cool breeze of an American afternoon kissed her determined face, Grace Monroe stepped forward into the unknown with dignity, with grace, and with a promise of retribution that would leave onlookers marveling at the transformation of personal suffering into a beacon of change. Grace Monroe walked down the jet bridge with a measured determination that belied the storm raging inside her heart. As she moved away from the confines of that first-class cabin, every step seemed to echo with the memory of that fateful moment at 35,000 feet. The moment when Diana Briggs, whose cold authority had once been unquestioned, had crossed the line and struck her in front of an audience. The shock of the slap had been compounded by the cruel undercurrent of racial prejudice, an all too familiar reminder that in a world built on inequality, a woman like Grace was all too often seen as less than she truly was. Now, as the cool American air enveloped her the instant her foot touched the bridge, she felt a strange surge, a mixture of relief, empowerment, and an unyielding resolve to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure such humiliation again. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of heavy introspection. Passengers who had witnessed the incident were now openly grappling with their own guilt. They knew that they had seen something shameful and had done nothing to stop it. A young woman in a navy blue pantsuit, probably in her mid-30s, slid aside to make room for others in the aisle. Clutching her tablet like a makeshift shield, she offered a timid, apologetic smile. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady hum of the plane. Grace paused for a moment, not out of courtesy but to ensure that this small act of remorse carried a meaning that transcended the immediate event. "You did what most people do," Grace said calmly, her tone both measured and resolute. "You stayed quiet." The woman's flushed face said enough. Regret had settled in deeply, an emotion that would haunt her for many days to come. At the same time as the cabin prepared for deplaning, airline operations staff and airport officials gathered near the rear exit. Their posture stiffened at the sight of Elliot Grant, who had been Grace's steadfast ally throughout the ordeal. "Mr. Grant," one of the officials said quickly, "we've arranged private transport and secured the executive conference lounge. Your counsel is already on site." Elliot shook his head, his voice low but firm as he replied, "We will debrief there, but we will walk through this terminal just like everyone else. There is no backdoor nonsense." The man blinked uncertainly, then murmured, "Understood, of course." At that moment, Grace stepped off the aircraft first, feeling not just the physical contrast of the cooler air outside but also an emotional liberation that was almost palpable. The oppressive control that Diana Briggs had once wielded over her in that confined space was gone, replaced by a newfound position, voice, and power that filled her with an inner glow. Inside the bustling terminal, the scene was a study in stark contrasts. The airline's executive liaison, a stern woman clad in a dark red blazer adorned with a corporate pin, stood rigidly by a corridor. Flanked by 3 members of the airline's legal and human resources teams, she watched everyone emerging from the gate with guarded eyes. They did not appear relaxed. Rather, they wore expressions that spoke of imminent impact and responsibility. As Elliot and Grace approached, the liaison stepped forward briskly. "Ms. Clark," she began formally, extending a hand. But Grace, whose dignity had been restored through her unwavering resolve, did not take the offered hand. Instead, she said, "Let's skip the surface-level regret. Your apology was due back in the air. We are past that now." The woman faltered for a moment and then stammered, "We understand this is serious. We're treating it with the highest level of urgency." Grace's eyes narrowed as she corrected, "Ms. Briggs has been placed under immediate review." "Not review, investigation." The tension in the room mounted as Elliot stepped forward, his voice low and laden with authority. "Let's make this clear," he said. "There will be a written statement from your office within 24 hours acknowledging not only the incident but the system failures that enabled it. That includes gaps in training, a lack of cabin accountability, and unchecked behavioral bias among your senior staff." A legal representative cleared his throat while one of the officials attempted to interject that discussions would be held in the lounge, but Grace interrupted sharply. "We're not here for discussions. We are here for acknowledgement. The time for discussion ended the moment your employee raised her hand against me." A palpable silence fell over the group. The woman in the red blazer's voice became tinny as she mumbled her apology again, and it became clear to everyone that this was not a matter that could be swept under the rug. The earlier negligence had extended far beyond the single act of physical aggression. It had been allowed to fester due to a culture that viewed discrimination as an unfortunate but routine byproduct of the system. Elliot then added succinctly, "We know the way." With that, they walked past the group in controlled, unhurried strides, leaving the executive lounge behind. The hustle and bustle of the terminal buzzed around them with the usual noise of announcements, rolling luggage, and distant boarding calls, yet for Grace, it all seemed to fade into the background as she walked with a powerful sense of purpose. As Grace passed by, she felt the lingering eyes of the other passengers, those who had seen her being slapped, those who had witnessed the fallout, and those who had silently borne witness to the injustice. She did not wear her inner pride on her sleeve, nor did she seek attention. She simply carried herself with a calm dignity that made people stop and reconsider their own complicity in maintaining a system that treated some as second-class citizens. Over by a coffee kiosk, a young man whispered to his friend, "That's her, the lawyer, the one who got slapped." His friend replied in an awed tone, "I heard her boss owns a stake in the airline." Yet Grace's focus remained unwavering, her eyes set resolutely ahead as she continued her journey. Approaching the glass doors of the executive wing, Grace paused and turned to Elliot. "I don't want her, no, I want it written into policy, so that no crew member ever lays a hand on a passenger without an investigation and third-party review," she stated sharply. "I want that on record." Elliot nodded in affirmation. "It will be," he assured her quietly. Then, with that final remark, she added, "I want to be able to walk through this airport one day without wondering if I'll be treated like I don't belong." Elliot met her steady gaze and replied, "You just made sure that day comes a lot sooner." As the glass doors opened, Grace and Elliot stepped into the corridor, leaving behind the cacophony of routine airport activity and entering a space that promised accountability and reform. Inside the executive conference suite, the mood was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past hours. The air was cool, the walls pristine, and the long oak table arranged with an austere elegance. Soft overhead lighting bathed the room in a clinical glow, while high-end leather chairs and neatly arranged bottled water suggested an environment of calculated efficiency rather than warmth. Despite the polished setting, there was a tension that was almost tangible, the kind that comes when those in power are forced to confront the consequences of their neglect. 5 members of the airline's senior leadership team were seated at the table, including individuals whom Grace recognized from previous legal negotiations. Among them were the company's legal affairs director and the chief operating officer, but the most imposing figure was the chief executive officer, Russell Langley. As Russell rose to greet them with a tentative hand extended for a handshake, Grace refused it. With a calm yet cutting tone, she said, "Ms. Clark, Mr. Grant," addressing the room formally and directly, "I want to begin by saying that I did not come here for performance apologies. I need accountability." Russell's smile faltered as he attempted to explain. "I want to begin by saying how deeply sorry I am for the incident you were forced to endure on our aircraft. It was inexcusable and wholly unreflective of our company values." But Elliot, standing solidly behind Grace's chair, interjected with icy clarity, "I don't need your values. I need your accountability." The room grew tense, and Russell gestured for everyone to take their seats. A representative from legal slid a formal letter of apology across the table, a document approved by the board that outlined a preliminary outline of an internal investigation into Ms. Briggs' conduct. "She has been removed from duty and placed on indefinite suspension pending the outcome of the investigation," the representative stated flatly. Grace did not immediately reach for the letter. Instead, her eyes burned with a steady fire as she asked, "I would like to know precisely when that investigation began." After a pause, the chief operating officer replied, "About 20 minutes after your arrival was confirmed, following her escort off the aircraft." Grace's voice cut through the air with measured wrath. "Not when she slapped me, not when passengers witnessed it, and not when she tried to lie about it in front of everyone. I wanted on record that the investigation began only after the incident had been swept into your internal channels." Russell leaned back in his chair, his expression betraying regret. "That is unfortunately true, and we regret that delay." Without missing a beat, Grace continued, "I have been a corporate attorney long enough to know what happens when a company says we regret after the fact. It means you waited to see how bad the fallout would be before taking action. I am not here to be your shield. I am here to be your reckoning," Elliot added quietly. "Let's not waste more time with hollow apologies. We are here because your airline made a deliberate choice, a cultural choice, and that choice extends far beyond a single slap." The head of human resources attempted to interject, saying, "We understand the gravity of the situation, and we are already preparing mandatory training revisions, enhanced anonymous reporting procedures, and a formal commitment to external audits of in-flight conduct." Grace's eyes glowed with the intensity of someone who had already borne the burden of indignity for too long. "Start with that," she stated firmly, setting her phone down and pressing play on an audio recording. The room fell into a heavy silence as a recording, captured by a vigilant passenger in row 5, began to play. The recording featured the clear, cold voice of Deanna Briggs speaking to Jessica in the galley, a voice that contained not the authority of a seasoned flight attendant, but the brittle timbre of someone whose actions had been dictated by prejudice and impulsive cruelty. Faint murmurs and exclamations of disgust and awkward laughter punctuated the background as the recording unfolded. Then came Jessica's voice, accusatory and unyielding. "You didn't check anyone else's ticket." The room was struck silent by the weight of the evidence. Grace stopped the recording and looked up at the assembled airline executives with piercing clarity. "That, right there, is your culture," she said slowly. "A culture of indifference and unchecked authority." Outside the executive wing, as they neared the entrance for private car service, the rhythm of the airport resumed its typical pace. Travelers rushed to catch their flights, children tugged at their parents' sleeves, and overhead announcements echoed in a steady cadence. Yet for Grace, the world had irrevocably shifted. Walking beside Elliot, she reflected on the events of the past hours, realizing that she had not come here for vengeance alone. Rather, she had come to secure a future in which no one else would ever be made to feel less than they were, where every passenger in seat 3A or any other seat would know that their dignity was inviolable. A moment passed as they paused by a set of glass doors, and Grace turned to Elliot with a quiet intensity in her eyes. "I don't want someone to be just suspended for a moment," she said, her voice low but carrying the full force of her conviction. "I want it enshrined in policy that no crew member ever lays a hand on a passenger without an investigation that includes a third-party review. I want that on record." Elliot looked at her with sincere admiration and said, "It will be on record." Grace continued, her tone growing sharper. "And I want to walk through this airport one day and not have to question whether I belong or if I'm treated with the respect everyone deserves." Elliot met her gaze and replied, "You just made sure that day comes much sooner." Their conversation was interrupted as they approached the glass doors leading to the curb. A subtle murmur ran through the crowd of bystanders. Passengers who had witnessed the tumult on board now observed the unfolding ramifications with an air of quiet, overdue respect. The young man near the coffee kiosk, who earlier whispered about her identity as the lawyer who got slapped, now stood silent as Grace passed by, her presence a living challenge to the entrenched system that had once deemed her unworthy. Public opinion began to sway as more details emerged about the investigation into Diana Briggs' conduct. It became painfully evident that the failure was not solely hers, but symptomatic of a larger institutional neglect that had allowed unchecked authority to thrive. Corporate executives were forced to confront their own complacency as they were held accountable for policies that had, in effect, condoned acts of aggression in the name of maintaining order. A formal review was launched by the board, and witnesses from the flight were encouraged to come forward. The media, hungry for stories of corporate downfall and ultimate redemption, filled every available space with discussions of Grace Monroe's unwavering stance. A stance that demanded reform not just for her own sake, but for every individual who had ever been dismissed or diminished in the eyes of an indifferent system. As Grace prepared for her next steps, she made a promise to herself and to all those who had silently endured the injustice of unchecked bias. She would ensure that no one else would ever experience the crushing weight of humiliation in a place that was supposed to be safe and dignified. Her upcoming meetings with high-level executives and legal strategists were not merely opportunities for retribution. They were a clarion call for a complete cultural overhaul. In every statement she issued, every word she spoke, there was a resounding echo of the struggle for equality and respect, a struggle that had been building for far too long. Grace Monroe's journey from that traumatic moment in the skies to her triumphant stance in the corridors of corporate power had been marked by countless hardships and moments of introspection. Yet, through it all, she had maintained a grace and strength that inspired everyone who heard her story. Her determination had not only demanded accountability from those who had wronged her, but had also ignited a broader movement that challenged long-standing norms and spurred real, lasting change in an industry that had once seemed impenetrable. In the end, as Grace Monroe stepped out into the cool American afternoon, her eyes reflecting both the scars of the past and the brightness of an unyielding future, she knew that her mission had only just begun. She was not merely the woman who had been slapped in front of a full cabin. She had become the symbol of a revolution, a living, breathing testament to the power of dignity reclaimed and the promise of justice served. And though the road ahead would be filled with obstacles and challenges, her clear, steady voice would continue to rise above them, calling for a world where every person could finally feel at home, respected, and truly free. Grace Monroe's unwavering gaze never faltered as she stepped into the sleek black sedan waiting outside. After the tumultuous flight and the painful slap delivered by Diana Briggs, a woman who had once embodied supposed authority now exposed as a cruel instrument of racism, Grace knew her journey toward justice was far from over. While Elliot Grant's firm words echoed in her ear that accountability would change the system forever, Grace pressed further. "What happens next?" she asked softly, her voice steady but laced with deep hurt. "After this meeting and all the headlines fade, will you truly change things? Or will you file your report and let people forget?" Elliot's response was firm. "You do not walk away." As they settled into the car, Grace's phone buzzed with a message from the airline's internal network announcing an immediate policy update. Every flight attendant was now required to complete new bias training, and all misconduct would face strict legal review and third-party arbitration. Grace leaned back against the seat, gazing out the tinted window at travelers hurrying by. The silence of those who once looked away had finally been broken, and Grace Monroe was determined that no one would ever be made to feel they did not belong again. Grace Monroe stepped away from the podium without a hint of pride, her gaze as steady as ever even as she left the room brimming with activists and former passengers demanding change. Outside the building, a diverse crowd had gathered, holding signs that declared messages like, "I was in 3A, service not suspicion," and "She changed the rules." There was no need for applause. Grace knew that the impact of her words had already begun to dismantle the very culture that had once silenced her. Activists mingled with people who had endured subtle indignities and overt racism, and as she moved among them, her presence spoke louder than any cheer. She spotted a woman near the back, dressed simply and unadorned, whose steady eyes locked with Grace's for a long, charged moment. It was Diana Briggs, now stripped of her uniform and authority, left behind by the system she once manipulated. Grace did not acknowledge her. Instead, she turned and continued her purposeful stride, leaving Diana to face the consequences of her cruelty. Later that evening, in her modest apartment, lit softly by warm lamplight and the gentle hum of the city, Grace's phone buzzed with a forwarded internal memo from airline CEO Russell Langley. The message announced a new standard. No longer would the airline operate under outdated protocols that privileged some while silencing others. The memo declared that following the incident on Flight 727, the airline would rebuild from the ground up to ensure that every human being on board was treated with dignity, no matter their skin color or where they sat. As Grace absorbed the words, a sense of quiet vindication filled her. She recalled how she had once been questioned not for her behavior or credentials, but for her very presence, and she resolved that no one would ever again have to sit in a seat, be it 3A or any other, that diminished their worth. The media had latched onto her words, and headlines brimmed with the memorable line, "I'm not here to be your face of progress, I'm here to be your mirror." Editorials dissected every nuance, and soon Grace became a symbol of accountability and justice for everyday passengers. She refused to be swept away by the noise of celebrity. Instead, she focused on translating her painful experience into systemic reform. At her firm's headquarters, where she had been quietly elevated to senior ethics counsel due to her steadfast resolve, every policy update was published publicly. The new Passenger Protection and Crew Accountability Charter was not meant for credit, but for enforcement, ensuring that no crew member would ever again be allowed to exercise unchecked authority. Weeks later, as Grace boarded a new flight alone for a routine business trip, she no longer faced intrusive questioning. The young flight attendant greeted her warmly, saying, "We've read your training modules. Thank you for making it safer for us all." That simple acknowledgement was a testament to the sweeping change her courage had sparked. Glancing out the window as her plane taxied down the runway, Grace closed her eyes, not to escape, but to embrace a calm born of hard-won justice. From the disgrace of 3A to the empowerment of 1A, her journey had redefined not just her seat on a plane, but her place in a transformed system that now protected every passenger's right to exist with dignity.